Welcome to episode 22 of Islam in the Contemporary World, a new narrative. Is jihad truly about war, or has its true meaning been lost to history and extremism? Today, Zafarullah helps us reclaim the essence of jihad, not as violence, but as a powerful, peaceful struggle for justice and dignity in the modern world. We're diving into some material provided by a listener today, grappling with a concept that feels incredibly weighted and, well, misunderstood in the modern world. The term jihad.
It really is. And the author of this source material, they don't shy away from that complexity at all. Their central argument, pretty much right up front, is that Islam has been, and these are their words, misused, becoming a tool for exploitation, poverty, and terror.
Yeah, and they connect this partly anyway to this feeling that Muslims have become stuck to the past, and haven't really engaged enough in what's called ijtihad.
Right, that process of independent reasoning, basically interpreting Islamic law for new situations.
Exactly. And the author feels this has sort of held Muslims back from building a truly dynamic modern Islamic existence, stopping them from, reaching their full potential and living peaceful, prosperous lives.
Precisely. The call from the author is quite stark, actually. It's basically time for Muslims to arise out of deep slumber and reform themselves. And they argue that getting terms like jihad right, understanding their actual meaning, is absolutely fundamental to any kind of reform.
Oh, right. So let's unpack this a bit.
Yeah.
When we look at the world today, we see so much conflict carried out, supposedly in the name of jihad. The source mentions millions killed in places like Algeria, the conflicts between India and Pakistan, Kashmir, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Palestine, Syria, Egypt. It's a devastating list.
And the author immediately challenges this modern picture. They contrast it directly with the revolution brought about by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, over his 23 years of prophethood.
And this is where the source gives some numbers that really make you stop and think. During the Prophet's entire time, they mentioned something like 100 military excursions or expeditions in total. The Prophet himself apparently took part in just 27 direct encounters.
Yeah, and the human cost cited for all of that, it's remarkably low when you think about it. Only about, 259 Muslims martyred?
259 Muslims.
Yeah.
And only around 759 non-Muslims killed across all those events.
The source actually calls that period a bloodless revolution by comparison. It was one of history's biggest intellectual, spiritual, and moral shifts, yet achieved with, incredibly little bloodshed compared to the scale of modern conflicts often labeled as jihad.
It really throws that disconnect into sharp relief, doesn't it? And it brings to mind that powerful quote the author includes from the poet Faiz Ahmad, talking about the earth sucking the blood of the poor. It feels like the author sees that happening today, tragically, under the banner of a misused term.
And what's absolutely critical to grasp here, according to the source, is that jihad is a very broad, very comprehensive term. It gets frequently and incorrectly narrowed down and just confused with qital.
Right, and qital means specifically the physical fighting, the actual armed struggle.
Exactly. So jihad isn't just the fight, it's the broader strive. The Quran uses the term in Surah Al-Hajj, chapter 22, verse 78, saying, "And strive in his way as you ought to strive." That striving is key.
And scholars have really dug into what that striving means, haven't they? Figures like Maududi describe jihad as a long struggle and strenuous effort, while Sanallah of Panipat defines it broadly as struggle, expansion, and power. These takes really push beyond just the military angle.
Which leads us to this concept of jihadi kabir, the great struggle. The source points to a verse from a very early chapter, Surah Al-Furqan, chapter 25, verse 52, revealed back in Makkah, before the migration. Allah tells the Prophet, "Listen not to the non-believers, but strive against them with the utmost strenuousness, jihadi kabir."
And the context there is so important, isn't it? Because this was revealed when the early Muslims in Makkah were facing persecution, but were explicitly not allowed to use swords or physical force, not even for self-defense at that stage.
Precisely. The instruction was to wage this great struggle using the Quran itself, its message, its truth, not the sword.
So jihad kabir, as the source presents it, it's fundamentally this lifelong moral and spiritual struggle. It's against evil, injustice, ignorance on all levels.
Exactly. It means a Muslim is called to peaceful effort against exploitation, poverty, oppression. Now, qital, the armed struggle, it does exist for specific limited circumstances like defense against serious persecution or aggression. But the main overarching concept of jihad is this much broader, often non-violent striving.
And the source breaks down this jihadi kabir into sort of three layers, right? There's the intense individual effort, then a large-scale community effort using all available resources, and finally a comprehensive struggle on every front, intellectual, social, economic, moral. It's all encompassing.
hmm And this understanding is actually echoed in the Sunnah, the Prophet's teachings and practices. The source brings up a well-known account related by Bayhaqi, where the Prophet, returning with his companions from the Tabuk expedition, that was his last big military campaign before Makkah was conquered, reportedly called the armed struggle, the qital, jihadi sagir, the small struggle.
The small struggle. Wow. So what was the big one?
He called the ongoing work of spreading the message dawah, inviting people to Islam. That was jihadi kabir, the great struggle.
Yeah, it really reframes things, doesn't it? The missionary work, the intellectual, the spiritual effort that's seen as the bigger jihad.
Absolutely. And there's another profound hadith cited by Panepati. A companion named Jabir asked about the bigger jihad when they got back from a campaign. The Prophet's reply was that the bigger jihad is when the man should wage jihad against his own desires and temptations. That points inwards, doesn't it? The primary battlefield is within ourselves.
Okay, so if jihad covers this deep internal struggle and this broader external nonviolent striving, what does the source say is needed to even, undertake it properly?
Mm.
It seems like you need to really understand Islam, why you're striving, but also recognize kufr, disbelief, and jahiliyyah.
Yeah, jahiliyyah being that state of sort of pre-Islamic ignorance and moral decay. The idea is you need to know what you're striving against as well as what you're striving for.
Right.
And there's a really striking point mentioned here attributed to Umar, one of the early caliphs. He apparently expressed concern about future generations raised only knowing Islam without really understanding jahiliyyah firsthand. He worried they might not recognize deviations and could disengage and loosen the cords of Islam.
Wow.
The author suggests Umar might have almost foreseen our current age, where they feel the noble idea of jihad has been tarnished and, vulgarized.
And that kind of brings us back full circle to the author's critique of modern conflicts. They argue that sometimes rulers or powerful groups will wage something they call jihad, but it's actually for their own self-interest, maybe even doing the bidding of foreign powers.
Yeah, the author paints a pretty heartbreaking picture. Rulers get resources, young people die fighting for those gains, mothers are left grieving, brides become widows.
It's a really scathing critique, and it reminds me of that Shakespeare quote the author uses again, "As flies to the wanton boys, we are to the gods. They kill us for their sport."
It powerfully captures the author's sense of lives being tragically wasted in conflicts that are mislabeled as some kind of sacred struggle.
Which then leads directly to a critical question the source really digs into. Who actually has the authority to declare qital, the armed struggle, even under those very specific, legitimate circumstances where it might be permitted?
Okay, this seems crucial. It really is. And this is a point the source emphasizes very heavily, drawing on, historical precedent and the consensus of major Islamic legal scholars throughout history. Armed conflict, qital, it simply cannot be declared by individuals or private groups.
So who can? It has to be the leader.
Yes, it can only be declared by the imam, meaning the legitimate leader, the head of state, or the state authority itself. The source cites established hadith collections like Sunan Abu Dawud and Sahih Muslim. There are narrations like, "Jihad is obligatory with every imam, whether he be pious or sinner."
So it's tied to the office, not the person's piety necessarily.
Exactly. And other narrations talk about obeying the imam, describing the imam as a shield who provides protection during conflict. It really reinforces this idea that organized defense, organized military action falls under the state's responsibility.
And this wasn't just a later idea.
No. Leading jurists from the very early centuries of Islam established this principle. Scholars like Imam Abu Yusuf, a huge figure in the 8th century, stated clearly in his writings, Kitab al-Kiraj, that no military expedition or attack should happen without the explicit permission of the imam or his appointed deputy.
Okay.
And Imam Muhammad al-Shabani, another foundational jurist, held very similar views in his work, Kitab al-Sivar al-Kabir.
So a real consensus there among the early scholars.
A very strong consensus, yes. The source even brings up a legal principle discussed by later scholars like Ala al-Din Abu Bakr al-Kasani. Basically, if some non-state actors from a country that has a peace treaty with a Muslim state carry out an attack, but their government isn't involved, the peace treaty with that government still holds.
Ah, interesting. So it again emphasizes that the state is the recognized entity in these matters.
Precisely. The source is adamant, both historically and legally. The right to declare armed conflict, especially in self-defense, rests squarely with the Muslim state. They argue you just don't find historical examples of major military actions, planning campaigns, sending armies, giving commands, handling prisoners, signing treaties happening outside the control of the recognized state authority.
Okay, but is there any exception? What if someone is just attacked out of the blue?
Well, the source does allow for one pretty reasonable exception: direct, immediate self-defense. If individuals or maybe a local community are under sudden attack with absolutely no warning and there's no way to contact the central government for protection or permission, then yes, the inherent right to defend your life applies.
That makes practical sense. And the source gives a really interesting historical example from 19th century British India, doesn't it? With the Ali Hadith movement.
Yes, prominent leaders of that movement, scholars like Nawab Siddiq Hassan Khan and Nazir Hussain Delvi, they actually considered waging an armed struggle against the British to be haram forbidden.
And why was that?
Their reasoning was exactly this point. There was no independent Muslim head of state, no Khalifa, under whose legitimate authority such a major action could be sanctioned. Nazir Hussain Delvi apparently even laid out really specific, quite demanding conditions for a legitimate armed struggle to even be considered. You needed sufficient weapons, you had to be operating from your own independent territory, and you needed a significant army, ideally at least half the size of the enemy's force.
So the conditions were incredibly strict, and the primary condition of legitimate state authority was missing.
Exactly. So the consensus view that the source puts forward is pretty clear-cut. Armed struggle, when considered as a collective duty, is the domain of the state, the government. It's not for individuals or, freelance groups to decide upon.
And the source explains why this is so important, right? It's about preventing chaos.
Precisely. Allowing individuals or unauthorized groups to wage their own private wars fundamentally undermines the state's authority. It creates chaos, it leads to a state within a state, and ultimately results in what the Quran calls fitna, internal conflict, disorder, social breakdown. And the Quran itself says in chapter 2, verse 191, that fitna is actually worse than slaughter. It's about preserving the social fabric.
Okay. Now, I know some groups today who do advocate for, let's say, non-state jihad. They sometimes point to a specific story from the time of the Prophet, the story of Abu Busayr and Abu Jandal, around the time of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
Oh, yes. The source tackles that argument directly and, frankly, refutes it pretty thoroughly, point by point.
Okay, so remind us of the context. This was after the peace treaty between the Prophet and the Makkans.
Right. And one really tough condition of that treaty was that any Makkan who became Muslim and fled to Medina had to be returned to Makkah. So Abu Jandal and later Abu Busayr, they escaped Makkah but couldn't stay in Medina because of this treaty term.
So where did they go?
They ended up forming a small group in a sort of no man's land, an area that wasn't under the jurisdiction of either Medina or Makkah. And from there, this group started intercepting and attacking Makkan trade caravans.
Okay, I see where this is going. So some people argue this shows the Prophet approved of, or at least tolerated, a non-state group fighting the Makkans, even though there was a treaty.
That's the argument some try to make, yes.
Okay.
But the source really dismantles it. They highlight several crucial facts. First, the group was operating outside the territory and the control of the Muslim state in Medina. Critically, it wasn't directed or financed by the state.
Okay.
Second, the Prophet himself had initially returned individuals like Abu Jandal, showing his commitment to upholding the treaty, even when it was clearly painful for his followers.
So he was sticking to the treaty terms.
Yes. And third, the source states very clearly that the Prophet never actually condoned or praised what Abu Busayr's group was doing. And importantly, Islamic jurists throughout history have never considered the actions of this specific group to be legitimate jihad.
So it wasn't seen as sanctioned holy struggle.
Not at all. The source argues this incident actually demonstrates the Prophet's strict adherence to the treaty obligations despite the difficulty. And again, that key point. The group operated from territory under its own control, not from within the established Muslim state.
The author seems quite strong on this point, saying Suggesting the Prophet supported them is a serious accusation.
Extremely strong. The author calls it a serious allegation against the Prophet's integrity, one that even the Makkans, who are the ones being attacked by this group, never made at the time.
Right, so the source's conclusion is pretty definitive then.
Absolutely firm. This specific historical incident cannot be used as a precedent to justify modern non-state actors waging what they call private jihads from within established nation-states today. It just doesn't fit the criteria.
It really hammers home the central argument we've been tracing from the source. That armed conflict, qital, which is so often mistakenly conflated with a much broader term, jihad, can only be legitimately declared, organized, and sanctioned by the formal constitutional state authority. Full stop.
And that actions taken by individuals or groups claiming this right for themselves are, according to this viewpoint, based on a serious misinterpretation. They're considered un-Islamic, and ultimately they just lead to fitna and anarchy, the very things Islam seeks to prevent.
Well, this deep dive has certainly clarified that crucial distinction between qital, the specific act of armed struggle, and the much bigger, more comprehensive understanding of jihad as this profound, ongoing struggle, both internal and external.
Definitely. And it's really highlighted the source's argument, backed by, historical examples and what seems to be a strong consensus among Islamic jurists, that when it comes to organized armed conflict, the authority rests solely with the established state, not with individuals, not with private groups.
So, thinking about everything we've explored today from this source material, here's maybe something for you, the listener, to reflect on.
If the truest, and indeed the bigger jihad, is actually that demanding, lifelong struggle against your own desires and temptations, and if external armed struggle, qital, is so strictly confined, needing a legitimate declaration only by a state authority under very specific conditions, well, what does fully grasping this understanding change about how you perceive and maybe even engage with the whole concept of jihad in our contemporary world? It certainly leaves you with a lot to think about.